In conversation with Phoenix Mendoza. Phoenix Mendoza lives in the woods with her wife where she raises pigeons, buried roadkill, and ride. An unashamed enthusiast of the Kana compost table and coopery, she is wholly dedicated to finding and lacerating and the junction where beauty and disgust met to rot together. She writes horror like erotica and erotica like horror. Salivation is a debut anthology. And on to the next episode of Photo Interview, it's my utmost pleasure and joy to have on the show today, Phoenix Mendoza. How are you doing, Phoenix?
I'm doing great, Peter. Thank you.
Yeah, it's quite a lovely, it's quite a joy, quite a pleasure actually to have you on the show today. And quite nice you have a lovely small introduction.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
Yeah, yeah. So, Phoenix, I want to first say congratulations on the release of your book, Salivation, which I believe is a first published works. And I would like you to tell us about how the book came about. What inspired you to write Salivation, and how did you come about with this particular title name for the topic, which I kind of find quite lovely and uncommon, really.
Thank you. So this is Salivation. I did the cover art
Beautiful
myself.
cover. Interesting.
Thank you. It's really common for people to think that it's called salvation and then do a double take and realize that it's
Oh,
salivation, the act of salivating,
yeah,
like your mouth filled with spit.
yeah.
And it's a short story collection, and every story is about the intersection between hunger and loneliness. So that's sort of
Mm,
why I went with that route with the title. You asked how it came about, and actually, I was in the process of teaching the first incarnation of a writing class that I teach when I started putting together Salivation. I have a module in that that is about the act of going back, looking at old works, and sort of
mm.
resurrecting them instead of abandoning old works as failures, looking at them again and seeing if you can breathe new life into them. And I realized
Absolutely.
in teaching this module that I hadn't done that in a while. And I was like, I can't tell my students to do this if I'm not implementing it myself? So I was like, all right, I'm going to go on a deep dive through some old laptops and look at some old pieces, see
Mm,
if there's anything to salvage. And in the process of doing that sort of reconnaissance salvage thing,
yeah.
I noticed that every story that was worth salvaging, that had like a really good seed or a spirit or something interesting that was worth revisiting, they all were about the same thing, which was hunger and loneliness, that sort of
Mm,
desperation or starvation we feel to seek human connection, I guess.
mm,
So I started going through the process of dusting off those old stories and seeing what I could do to bring them up to my current standard. And some of them needed a full rewrite. Many of them I scrapped completely and just took the idea and the concept and rewrote them from the ground up. And
mm,
then other ones were nearly complete and they just needed an ending or a quick revision. So this is actually in many ways sort of a collection of reanimated corpses. There are things that I've written over the course of my writing career over the last 10,
mm.
12 years even.
Wow.
Some of them I did write this past year and just salvaged the concept originally. But that means it's this very vulnerable collection of stories because they're from um, past versions of myself, sometimes
Mm.
even saying versions of myself.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's where it came from.
Yeah, I enjoy listening to you talk about this. And even from the title, you can easily tell that it's an erotical novel. Yeah, and that's
Mhm.
want to get me to ask you, how do you develop likeness, or will I say, how do you develop passion, admiration, writing in this particular genre of literature in the erotical theme? Would you like to talk about that?
Yeah. So I think that oftentimes so I write horror and erotica and sort of horror erotica, like a combination of the two. And I think that
Interesting.
oftentimes those genres are considered lowbrow. They're sort of
Mm,
like sordid, like paperback, like almost trashy.
yeah.
And what I like to do is take those genres and elevate them to a literary standard. My
Oh.
writing is very literary and psychological. And I think that sex and death, sex and horror, those are two of the most universal human experiences.
Absolutely.
They're we all die and we all reproduce, or if we're not reproducing, we're still doing the act of reproduction. So
Mm,
those are sort of the driving forces of existence are life and death, sex and death. And
mm,
there's no reason for those things to be exclusively a lowbrow type of art. And so I do have a lot of respect and admiration for writers who write these genres, even if they do write them in a lowbrow way, because I think it takes guts to go there.
yeah.
But I like taking sort of what's in the gutter and like ripping it up to the stars, and then also like taking the stars and bringing them down to the gutter, like debasing and profaning the divine. That juxtaposition is something that's really compelling to me, and I think is a really common thread in all of my work.
Interesting. I enjoy you talking about this, and I love your illustration, your answers, your demonstrations as well. Sounds quite lovely and quite beautiful to me. Thank you.
Thank
Thank you for
you.
mentioning. Yeah. And also, you have another book, or would I say you have an upcoming book in the name of Yellow Wallpapering. Could you tell us a bit
Yeah.
about it without giving much information away? And how did you choose a title as well? I think you have an amazing sense with picking your title name, really.
Thank you. I appreciate that. So this is Yellow Wallpapering. It actually is out as a paperback and an ebook right now, but I'm still waiting on an additional edition of it, but it is
Oh.
still kind of available. It's in like a limbo space. But anyway, I chose the title Yellow Wallpapering based on the Charlotte Perkins Gilman story, The Yellow Wallpaper, which is sort of like a staple in American literature that everybody reads in high
Oh,
school. And it's about a woman who's sort of held imprisoned in her own home for being like
oh,
hysterical. And she's in a room with like bolted windows and the bed bolted to the ground. And she's surrounded by this peeling yellow wallpaper. And she starts to see when trapped in the wallpaper and becomes obsessed with freeing her, thus freeing herself. And it really stuck with me as a teenager. It disturbed me immensely. It's about her madness, her slow descent, and I went to an all-girl private Catholic school, and we all read this story and we were all terrified by it. And so we
mm,
started using the phrase, me and my friends in high school, yellow wallpapering to mean like spiraling in a female way,
oh,
like feeling crazy as women and being like, nobody takes us seriously, and like, just struggling with the condition of being a woman. We're like, I'm yellow wallpapering today. And so this collection is 10 stories about 10 women going crazy in sort of like a justifiable madness way, whereas like as the reader reads it, they're like, yes, good for her, I
mm,
understand why this is happening. So I
mm.
used that verb, yellow wallpapering, to sort of encompass the experience of like distinctly female like induced psychosis.
Yeah, I love your take on that. That sounds quite amazing. And yeah, thank you for giving us a seepnet into yellow wallpapering. Thank you. And I'd also like to ask you, as authors, we all have different ways of reacting to feedbacks and criticism of our works. And I'm curious to know your opinion about criticism. As someone who has written in an amazing genre, I'd love to ask you, how do you react to negative reviews of your books, just in case you've ever had one in the past?
Yeah, so before I published original horror, I wrote fan fiction in online spaces, and I was
Oh,
a highly controversial fan fiction writer because in
mm,
most, like in its purest incarnation, fan fiction tends to be romance. And I was not writing romance, I was writing sort of like horrific, obsessive, toxic
mm,
takes on and it was looked down upon. So I
mm,
suffered an enormous criticism in those spaces, and it used to really bother me. I used to internalize it. I would hear these the negative comments, and then I would like, memorize them, and like I couldn't get them out of my head, and they bothered me. But instead
mm.
of discouraging me from writing, they made me want to write more because I had a very
Wow.
like fuck you attitude about it, where I was like, yeah, you don't like it? Too bad. I'm gonna do it twice as hard. And so I think that actually a lot of the like my haters ended up sort of fueling me to become the writer I am today. And honestly, now as an adult, I've been writing for about 20 years now. I'm in my 30s, and I started when I was like a preteen. Like started sharing writing online. I think that at this point in my life, I
Mm,
would rather people either love my writing or hate my writing than
mm,
think my writing is boring. If I'm inspiring like people being like angry and uncomfortable and disgusted by my writing, that to me is a win. That's more of a success as a horror
absolutely.
writer than people being like, this is boring and I'm not that into it. And like, I'm not writing for an audience. Like, I'm writing for myself and what I choose to say. And so I would rather stick to my guns and my artistic vision and what I believe in
Mm,
and have people hate it than be writing, you know, a knockoff, like everything else, sort of like a boring, homogenized text that people are like, yeah, it was unmemorable. I read it and I forgot it. I would prefer to be unforgettable, even if it's with like a veneer of hatred, than to be
oh goodness.
forgettable. So I don't mind my haters. They can hate all they want.
That got me laughing really hard. I read it, I forgot it. You only forgot things that are not really meaningful. I'd say if you read a book and it's striking, you would always remember everything you read. Well, I read it, I forgot
Yeah.
to be like, oh, that sounds boring, really. Yeah, I love your take. I love your take on that.
Thank
Thank
you.
you. Thank you
Yeah,
for
we've all read
sharing.
books that we just don't remember afterwards. And it doesn't mean they're bad or anything, but
Mm,
that's not what I'm seeking to do as a writer. I want to make my readers feel. I want to
mm,
be evocative and memorable and disturbing. And if my
mm.
readers are uncomfortable with what I write,
I
like
see.
that's fine with me. At least it stuck with them. At least it made them feel something in their body, you know?
Mm. Oh, I love you. I would call that mission. I'll call that your aim, yeah. And I love
Hmm.
that really. It's an amazing trait to have as an author. It kind of make you induce some amazing qualities into your writing style, into your characterization in a way that, after reading them, the readers will like, oh, keep painting image in their head as they read along, feeling as if they're watching a movie, and it's quite memorable that even in several months after they've read it, they still remember entirely what happened in the book.
Yeah.
That's an amazing,
Sticks.
captivating way and compelling, making readers getting absorbed in a novel. I love that.
Thank you.
Yeah, I love that. Now, I've always been fascinated about how authors, especially novelists like yourself, craft long sentences and bring works together in a way that it eventually makes a great novel. This always leaves me thinking exactly how did they get the ideas and inspirations to write these works? How did they put all of these
Mhm.
things together in where you have pages making chapters and chapters compiling together, making an amazing, lovely book? Now, as far as writing is concerned, I'd love to ask you, how do you get your inspirations and ideas for your works? Where do they come from?
So I feel like my answer to this is threefold. They come from like three major places.
Yeah.
Number one, that I do everything like a writer. Writing for me is not just sitting in front of a computer and like typing out the word through the world constantly as a writer and compiling images
Mm,
and observations of the world all the time. Like if I'm in a waiting room, I'm not going to like sit and scroll on my phone. I'm going to like obsessively watch everybody and describe things in my head. And like I'm
mm,
constantly taking in sensory information so that I can put it in my works later. And that's how you make things have that sort of cinematic movie feel, is like creating a full sensory immersive experience. So
mm,
many of like the detail work in my books comes from just lived observation of the world. Um, I'm not necessarily writing about myself or like in a self-insert way, but I am writing about how I observe the world in a sensory manner all the
mm,
time. So that makes up a lot of where ideas come from. It's just observation. In my writing class, which is called Blood Ink Bone, I talk about that process as like drawing blood, where you're like taking a syringe and like putting it into the world and like sucking the blood out and then
mm,
putting it into an inkwell so that you can like dip your pen in it later and write with it, where you're like constantly absorbing things.
mm.
So again, that makes up the big bowl. Second part of this is that I think my plots and the concepts and the themes I explore, that comes from my obsessions, like what I am obsessed
Wow.
with. There are some themes that I will just revisit over and over and over again, which is why I can have an entire collection of stories about, you know, hunger and loneliness, or an entire collection of stories
Mm,
about women going crazy, because I get really obsessed with particular concepts and have to just like revisit and revisit from every possible angle.
yeah.
So obsession, observation, and then lastly, threefold. This is going to sound ridiculous, but it's true. But I'm so driven by spite. A lot of my ideas will come from watching something or reading something that I feel like doesn't do the concept justice. And I'm like,
Mm,
I could do that so much better. Or it'd be like, I really wanted this to go this way. I wanted it to be honest and authentic and vulnerable. And instead it was kind of like mass markety,
mm,
uh, old punches. And so that is another really big motivator. And many my ideas comes from
wow.
dissatisfaction, I guess, at reading other things. Um, I just finished a novel manuscript for a novel that's going to be coming out in October, and I'm super excited about it. And that I wrote that novel. I started writing that novel because I had just seen the movie Saltburn, which I
Wow.
enjoyed, but everybody in my life was telling me how much I'd love it and how great it was and how much it reminded them of me and that it was like very like doused in body fluids and like super psychosexual. And so
Mm,
I was like excited. I went to go see it and I was like, yeah, this is good, but I could go so much further.
more
And
further.
my book, Thorngale, my novel, it bears no resemblance to Saltburn whatsoever. It's not like you would
Mm,
read this book and be like, oh, this was inspired by this movie. There's no
mm, lovely
relation.
techniques,
It's
yeah.
just that experience of sort of dissatisfaction and like knowing that I had the capability to push it further in
Mm,
every direction it was kind of going in, um, made me conceptualize of and end up writing this whole 60,000 word manuscript.
wow.
Um, so, and that's happened to me before where like I see something and so it is the type of inspiration to be inspired by another work, even if it's like, some really good works make you want to write something as good as that, but sometimes crappy works make you want
Yeah,
to be like, I want to write something better.
yeah.
Um, so yeah, that's sort of
Oh,
like where a
wow.
lot of my ideas come from.
Well, I love this. I mean, so far I've been asking authors, whenever I ask people this question, some people say, well, I got my inspiration from my dreams. I got my inspiration from the things around me. I got my inspiration from personal life experiences. I got inspiration from this way and that way, the story of my friend, of that of his friend, of friends of friends. And I'll be like, oh yeah, that's an amazing way. But then to hear you talk about this in an amazing, lovely manner, it's quite beautiful to me. You derive your motivation from observation, from obsession, from dissatisfaction. It sounds like an amazing theorist, really. Yeah, to call it. Yeah. Phoenix Mendoza's theorist, I'd say.
Thank you.
Mode
It
of
works for
motivation and
me.
inspirations.
I write a lot as a result. I think that also I know a lot of writers who are incredibly skilled writers, but they're not
Yeah.
frequent writers. They're waiting for
Mm,
inspiration to strike them. It's like they won't write for months or even years, and then they'll have, something happen to a friend of a friend or something happen to them, and
mm,
then they'll write about it. Where I am constantly writing so many pieces because I'm like constantly in that state of like
interesting.
obsessing over things and
Wow.
also feeling that dissatisfaction. And I also oftentimes will go through the world asking myself the question, like, wouldn't it be up if blank happened? And then I'll be like, I'm a writer. I can write a story about that. And it's like we all
Mm,
do. We all have those shower thoughts moments where we're just like somewhere in the world and we have a weird thought or a wondering or a question or a invasive image that comes to us. And that's the power of being a creator is that you can be
mm.
like, oh, just, thought of this weird, gross, upsetting thing or this beautiful, stunning, like erotic thing and I'm just going to write it into a story. Some of my short stories have like very basic minimal plots because it was just like some particular thing that struck me in a moment. And why not write it? That's why I'm here.
Yeah, that's sort of the beauty of being a writer, being able to create a world on your own, being able to create a story on your own, being able to push
Yeah.
things further, it's an amazing way. Thank you for mentioning. I enjoy listening to that.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, and so apart from the books we've mentioned so far, do you have any other
Mhm.
works you've authored or say currently working on?
I have quite a few. So, as I stated, I just finished my novel manuscript. This is going to be my debut novel. I've
Yeah.
written novels before and never published them because the revision process is so daunting for a long work. It's much easier to revise a short story or a novella, whereas a novel is, I slow down a lot in the revision process. So, I've never actually gotten one to a publication state before. This is my first. I started it in December and I've gone through multiple drafts. It's already done. I wrote it so quickly. It's called Thorngale and it's coming out in October, and I am extremely excited about it. It is my favorite thing I've ever written, which is like
Mm.
saying a lot because I get really obsessed with everything I write. But like anyway, I'm so excited
Wow.
about it. And it's a historical fiction, sort of psychological gothic horror
Wow.
piece about two brothers who grow up in like parasitic isolation on a like decrepit estate in Cornwall. And I went to Cornwall to finish it. I was like that dedicated where I was like, I need to, if I'm going to write about somewhere I've never been before, I need to go there to get the full details. So
Mm.
it's very immersed in and steeped in its place. And I wrote it like a concertina wire, like a roll of barbed wire where it like starts wide and gets like tighter and tighter and
Oh.
tighter until it like ties into a little bow at the end. I'm just very proud of its structure. And
Wow.
yeah, super excited to share it with the world. It takes place in the mid 20s in England. So yeah, that will be
Wow.
coming out in October. And then one of my current ongoing projects is that I'm actually creating an oracle deck for it, like a tarot deck that has images from it,
Wow.
because I'm an artist as well. So I'm still kind of in that world, even though I've finished the manuscript. I still think about these characters like every night before I go to bed, and I'm still like very much immersed in
Mm.
their world. So that's one of my ongoing projects. Another one that I'm working on is a serialized novel inspired by the Sherlock Holmes stories. That's
Wow.
about the pair of Victorian paranormal investigators. And it's like vaguely inspired by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle's weird. So he's the writer of the Sherlock Holmes stories. His relationship with
Mm.
Harry Houdini, they were both really obsessed with spiritualism and fraudulent mediums and
Wow.
exposing fraudulent mediums. And
Wow.
I just find that era really interesting, sort of like when there was this almost like acceptance of the potential of the supernatural and a lot of people capitalizing on that.
Mm.
Um, this most of my work tends to be like very erotic and extreme. It's literary horror, but it has extreme horror elements. And this is far more like gothic, spooky, reading it by a fire, like cozy horror almost. It's a little bit of a different vibe. So
Wow.
think it'll be more accessible for a lot of my readers. So many of my readers from my fan fiction days can't read my current stuff because it's too like gross, graphic, and I'm like, this might be a better like ease them into it. And
Oh
then
goodness.
I have two other novels that I'm in the process of writing. I'm about 10,000 words into each.
Wow.
One of them is a feminist nuclear horror sci-fi novel. Um, called Mothership. And another one I'm loosely calling a game called Thrall, but I'm not sure if that'll be its final title. And it's like a fantasy horror piece about two sisters when they're children, they can access sort of a pocket universe that's very like
Oh.
Wonderland or Oz type of vibes. And then one of them disappears in that universe, and the other one is sent back to Earth to the
Wow.
real world, and she has to reconcile with whether or not all of her memories of this place and of her sister are real or not. So it is fantasy and it
Mm.
does have speculative elements, but it's also very much a psychological horror piece. All my stuff tends to be really psychological. I used to be a psychologist, used to be a therapist, so I tend to
Wow.
um, that's what I went to school for actually. So I'm often delving into the more like interior mental parts of horror. Uh my stuff doesn't I'm not it's not like serial killers and blood and werewolves and gore. It's like yeah, psychological, I guess.
Hmm. Wow, that sounds like a trunk load actually that you've got ongoing, really.
It is. I'm constantly writing. I constantly have like 10 projects. So
Oh, that's quite a lot, and I hope you find some times to sleep.
yeah, I do. I try.
Oh, goodness, that's quite beautiful. I really love and enjoy you talking about it. Thank you for sharing. Yeah,
You're
yeah.
welcome.
And I'd also like to ask you, as a published author, what sort of advice do you have for other writers who are still struggling with putting the works together and publishing a book? What would you advise people in this category?
So, my works are currently self-published. I actually, before I published horror, self-published horror, I worked with an indie press and had an agent and traditionally published romance novels under a
Yeah.
pseudonym. And I felt like I got a taste of traditional publishing and it wasn't for me. because I like to exert a lot of control over what I write. And I know
Mm,
my vision, I know what I want to say, and I know that it's not palatable or marketable in many ways. And I'm not interested in being palatable or marketable. And traditional
mm,
publishing, it doesn't really have a place right now for the sort of like literary but extreme horror that I write. So I shifted towards doing self-publication, which worked great for me. So one of my big pieces of advice, if for people seeking publication, is to try to figure out what method will be best for them and best suit their needs as an artist. Because you can
mm,
take the indie press route, you can take the traditional route where you query an agent and go that way, or you could take the
mm,
self-publishing route. And I think knowing yourself and knowing what type of artist you are and what you want to
yeah.
say, and it really is helpful in that because I sort of I don't think it was a mistake going down the
Mm,
route I went down originally.
yeah. Yeah.
But I did learn a lot and learned that it wasn't for me. And now I'm much happier. So that's one
Mm,
piece of advice I have. Another one is to start small. And instead of trying to publish your novel, to seek out and start sharing your work in a more like literary magazines,
mm,
anthology, submission
yeah.
calls, contests, like smaller
Yeah.
stuff. Because I self-publish, I still oftentimes want that validation of a professional being like, yes, you're a good writer. And so I will
Mm,
submit things to literary magazines and anthologies and get accepted. So I'm still like, okay, people are still continuing to publish my stuff in a professional way that can stroke my ego so
mm,
that I feel good about it. But I feel like that's also a really to just get in the process of putting yourself out there,
yeah.
having people read your writing, and then getting rejections and building up resilience to rejections for smaller
Absolutely.
work rather than putting all of your eggs in one basket with a novel manuscript that you put so much time and energy and love and sweat and blood and tears into, and then getting rejections and starting to feel awful. So I feel like just getting in the habit of like, writing those short
Yeah.
stories, shooting them out to magazines. Also, in doing this, I've realized so much about like that there's always a home for something you've written. Some of the weirdest stuff that I've written, I've been able to publish in literary magazines just by finding the right type of like super weird niche literary magazine.
Yeah.
There's
Yeah.
so much out there. And so I always tell writers who are starting to break into the world of publication, instead of going straight to like, how do I write a query letter?
Mm,
Instead, start looking at Submission Grinder or things that for smaller submissions. There's a wonderful woman, Angelique Fons. She writes a Substack article that where she publishes every month a list of speculative fiction open submission calls,
mm,
and briefly discusses like if she submitted to them before, what their rejections were like, if she was rejected, if they
mm,
give feedback, if they pay. And every month when she sends that out, I'm like, okay, do I have any short stories like sitting in my massive like, backlog that I can shoot out to just send to these publications? And
mm,
I feel like 50% of the time I get accepted, and then the other 50% of the time I learn something about that market, either that they're not
mm,
looking for what I write, this is sort of
yeah.
more their and in doing that, you build up resilience and you build up experience. And that I feel like is all really instrumental to the process of the endurance it takes to actually publish that
Mm,
novel. So yeah, start small. Also,
yeah.
writing communities are really huge. I enter in a contest called Writing Battle. It happens like 4 times a year, and they send you 3 prompts, and you write a short story with a certain word count, and then it's peer judged, and so you're in the judging process. It's really fun,
Mm,
um, and it's not like it's kind of a crapshoot whether you win or not. I don't enter it to win. There are cash prizes, which is cool, but the great thing about it is that it has an attached forum, and
mm,
people on the forums are also constantly in the process of submitting to different open calls and looking for publications. So it's an amazing
yeah.
way to build up a writing community because we
Mm,
write in isolation. The process of actually writing, sitting down in front of the computer, that's done alone. But having connections is so helpful for the
very
publication process.
helpful. Yeah.
Uh, so yeah, I
Wow.
those are sort of my recommendations for people who are starting to look at publishing as a possibility.
Wow, that's an amazing bunch of advice you've got for us. Thank you so much for sharing, and I'm hoping that viewers, including myself, would love to utilize it. Thank you. I took some notes while you were speaking. Yeah, I'd love to go over them again. Yeah, that's an amazing, lovely, educative points you've raised. Thank you once again. Yeah.
My
Yeah,
pleasure.
before we call it a day today, is there anything that you would love to share with the viewers about your books that we did not mention in this interview and you'd love the viewers to know? And also, where can interested viewers get a copy of any of your works?
Yeah, so Salivation is available on both Amazon and barnesandnoble.com.
Yeah.
And if you go to your local Barnes and Noble and ask them to order a physical copy, I believe they will. And then right now, Yellow Wallpapering is only available on Amazon. Barnes and Noble Press is having some technical difficulties right now, and so they
Mm,
weren't able to get it out in time, which is fine. They'll do it eventually. And then they're both available as ebooks on Amazon. Um,
interesting.
so the I've gotten copies from both of the presses and they come out pretty good, which is nice to know. They're because I do the cover art myself, so I like to know that they're looking good. Um and then in regards to things that we haven't talked about yet, I guess just to let readers know that if they're looking for something that is sort of undefinable and weird
Mm,
and grotesque and extreme and graphic and uncomfortable, but also literary. So sort of taking that the horror, pulp erotica and making it into a more literary, poetic, you know, that type of style, then they should check out what I write because that's what I do. And yeah, I would love people who are looking for that to actually find and read and enjoy my work.
yeah. Yeah. And I love to link in the description part of this interview where interested
Mhm.
viewers can get a copy of Phoenix Mendoza books directly on Amazon and also another platform. I also left a link to our social media following for possible followers. So thank you so much, Phoenix, for accepting the invitation to be featured on PA English Literature. It's wholesome, and I must say, it's a joy having you on the show, and I enjoyed everything you've discussed here today. Thank you.
Thank you for having me, Peter. It was really fun. I always love talking. So thank you.
Thanks for coming on. It was quite pleasurable. Thank you.
My
Quite
pleasure.
exciting. Yeah.